Alright, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Game and Compute. On this podcast, we talk about finances and income, jobs, education, side hustles. I want to speak to, I guess there's this viral, kind of older viral video going around with Kevin O'Leary talking about quiet quitting. Now, I've spoken about quiet quitting in bits and pieces in other episodes, and I've spoken about it in one longer episode. But I do think I want to focus on quiet quitting often. First of all, because the content seems to be in demand, and second of all, because I feel like I'm almost at the not really front lines, but I get a lot of input from people that are clients, that I almost refer to them like when I'm talking to my friends. I say it's almost like they're the street team, it's like they're the ones out there, beating the pavement, kind of like out there doing the jobs. Oftentimes, not having, maybe multiple degrees or the same type of experience with income and entry-level workforce types of positions. A lot of times too. So they're the ones who are working in a lot of jobs that I'm noticing are in demand, hiring. Now, for people who might not know what quiet quitting is, quiet quitting is basically not quitting. It is not doing your job. Quiet quitting is working to the company's standards, but not going above and beyond that. So, for example, if you have a job where, say for example, at my previous job, I believe we needed productivity which was at 95%. Now what that looked like was 5.5 hours a day of billable services. And after doing all the math, we realized that with all the meetings we have, if you take your 2 10-minute breaks and your 1 30-minute lunch, the only way to meet that 95% productivity was to do overtime, right? You couldn't meet 95% productivity unless you were multitasking, like writing during meetings, which would be billable because you're writing, so the time it takes you to finish documentation, charting and things like that, and then a lot of things we would have to put off to try to prioritize productivity, because we have to file a lot of paperwork. Sometimes you couldn't find the charts. We'd have to fax things. We couldn't bill for that. We'd have to mail stuff, which would require preparing the envelopes, printing out the labels on the envelopes, putting the right information, the client details on the letter, printing out the letter, stuffing the envelope, putting it in the right place. These were tasks that took maybe a few minutes at a time, but you would do them slowly because you don't want to screw up. You don't want to send the wrong letter to the wrong person. You don't want to put the wrong address on something and have it returned to sender. You don't want to screw up a diagnosis that you're writing in the letter. You don't want anything to go wrong, but all these processes took time. Sometimes you'd have to reload the printer paper and find the proper letterhead and go find copies of the letterhead, and sometimes they didn't have letterhead already printed, so you'd basically have to find the right type of paper and make letterhead paper just so you could print whatever letter. It's like, if you have 5 letters to print, this could easily take over an hour, and it's like, that's like not billable. That wasn't billable, so it didn't count towards productivity, even though you were working. So we had so many tasks that we just kind of didn't do because it wasn't counted as our productivity. People in my position, would have to have people review certain types of assessment reports that were like 20, 30 something pages long, and I'd have to go back in and edit it and then have them review it again. Like, that whole process would not be counted towards productivity. So I've had a job before where it's like the productivity was messy, but because we were always so behind and had to use overtime to catch up, we basically were able to use the overtime to we used the overtime to catch up, and then we would always meet productivity because the stuff we were doing in overtime was mostly assessments and care plans, which took at least an hour, if not like sometimes 2.5, 3 hours. It's like you're adding that to like a few times during the week, a couple times on the weekend, and then eventually your productivity would be like well over 100%. And so it's like you go from 95% that you needed, and then you'd have like 115% productivity or something ridiculous like that. So we were working way more, but the work itself didn't reflect the demands of the job, if that makes sense. Meaning that we had a high productivity demand where you couldn't meet productivity during work, and then we had such a high workload that you couldn't finish your work on time during work, and so you had to do overtime. And so with that, there wasn't really too much of what I would call quiet quitting, but something that you could classify as quiet quitting in a job where you have too much of a workload is if you know that you're taking work home anyways. Sometimes, it's like, well, I'm just going to spend half of my day, printing stuff and faxing stuff and filing stuff and like doing all these kind of like non-clinical tasks that are kind of like easier on the brain, easier on the emotions, because you're overwhelmed, because you're being overworked. So, that's a different type of an example. I understand this is a different kind of an example, but I feel like every work site has its own situations that contribute to somebody quiet quitting, or that contribute to staff quiet quitting. And if you can still work an 8-hour shift and never meet productivity, even though you're doing all of what you need to do, I mean, that is a flaw in the system of its own. So having too high of a workload, that's how I could see it contributing to quiet quitting. Is, you're basically trying to prevent yourself from burning out, and to do so, using the actual time during your shift to do less. You're doing less during your shift because you're just doing less during your shift. Let's be real. Like, there's no like specific reason behind it. Sometimes I feel like people just I mean, there might be a specific reason, but I feel like sometimes people just, it's a feeling. Now, Kevin O'Leary believes that people need to go above and beyond. And he says he would never allow people or want people working for his companies if they were practicing quiet quitting. But, you know, if I think about that type of job that I had in the past where it's like, yeah, we were going above and beyond, but, you know, we were still doing other tasks at work. Like, nobody was just, like, sitting there staring off into space, really. Like, you'd be working. But then there were a lot of times where we'd be just goofing off and, like, laughing together and making jokes and doing puzzles, and we had something that we referred to as happy hour, which wasn't really actual like alcohol at work, but because Thursdays we used to work from noon until 8 p.m. and it was very unlikely that we would ever get clients after like 5 or 6 p.m. And so usually around like 6:30 p.m. or 7 p.m. or something, we'd have a break that was longer than the normal 10-minute break, and it would usually be like an additional maybe 30-minute break. The bosses knew we did, and we'd take maybe that extra 30 minutes to sit together at like a conference table. Sometimes people would bring snacks. There's a nurse that would make like pancit or cakes or pies, or we'd bring like our own little snacks. Or, you know, there's a snack closet for clients. Sometimes we'd eat chips or like those gummy snacks, and, you know, bring coffee or tea or just hydrate. Or, you know, we'd have puzzles at the table, and we'd maybe have like coloring, you know, like colored pencils and some printouts of like coloring pages, and, you know, we kind of just chill and like hang out together. And it was kind of like team building, bonding. Anyone who had time was able to join, but there was no real work talk. But it wasn't lunch either. It wasn't lunch, and it wasn't a break. It was just something that we strategically did every Thursday. I mean, on our own during work. I mean, we were working till 8 p.m. and we did this in the evening. And if clients came in or if they called, we would take the call, but and have the session and do everything we needed. But if not, because usually there was nobody coming in, it's like nobody wants to work till 8 p.m. and then we still have to work 9 to 5 the next day. So things like that, you know, it's like when you have a job where you have too much demand, where you're taking work home just to meet the basic productivity, but then you know that just to actually finish your work, once you finish it and you see the numbers, that you're always going above productivity. Like most of the full-time clinical staff was always above productivity. That was very normal, which means, you know, even though it might have been considered a form of quiet quitting to not be doing just like running around clinical work during the shift, every single shift, 5 days a week, every single week, you know, we did take other types of breaks that weren't really, you know, in our, you know, break, you know, what was allowed for us. It wasn't really in the schedule for us to take those breaks, but also we didn't get like reprimanded for it or anything. And the burnout levels were just so high too. And so, yeah, like we would have like stacks. I remember like we would have stacks of like paperwork that we didn't have time to file. And we would have to basically borrow other people's mailboxes to put those stacks of paper into somebody else's mailbox, to hold them, because our mailboxes were like, say like 3 inches tall, and then like our stacks wouldn't fit in our mailbox, and so we'd have to put a stack in somebody else's mailbox. And then also a lot of people would take work home and do what we called like secret overtime. Like we weren't allowed to do this at all, but sometimes it was like unapproved overtime that was in secret, where you would take the work home, do the work, and then, you know, maybe not even bill, not even like put it on your productivity sheet, or properly bill all the amount of time it takes for you to do it, because you might just not bill for the whole thing, just because you're like, well, I really don't want to say that it took me 6.5 hours to do this assessment that usually takes people 2.5 hours. So they said it should take 2.5 or 1.5 hours, but usually it was taking us over 3 hours with all the paperwork. And so things like that, where it's like, there was definitely a discrepancy between the expectations of productivity, the amount of workload that we actually naturally did during work every day, the amount of demand that actually came from the clients that came into the clinic, and then the pressure to actually get things done in a timely manner, where we didn't really have the time, because you'd be writing notes during work sometimes, and then a client would come in and they're like, well, you need to finish your notes at the end of every day. And then it's like, well, but 2 clients came in while I was trying to do the one note from the one client, so now I have 3 notes instead of the one, and so like things would stack up like that because it was crisis related. And that's just an example of how quiet quitting can contribute, how people can maybe experience quiet quitting when you are actually going above and beyond, and you are doing more than the bare minimum of whatever the productivity expectation is, and you do get kind of like into the pressure of, okay, like I'm kind of stuck because they won't approve me for overtime, but I got all this work I need to get done. And so people taking work home and not getting paid for it, I mean, that's not even really considered okay, but it's like, you also don't want to get reprimanded for having too much late stuff, and then the company not getting paid because you're doing stuff late. The insurance isn't reimbursing those services. It's just, it was a mess, honestly. So, a lot of it is structure, dealing with mental health related, work sites. If the demand is so high like it was, it's like you're motivated to help all the clients, you're motivated to like assist all of these people. And so sometimes just working a little bit more, a little bit harder, pushing yourself a little bit more isn't the worst, but then also having like a good community of people that you actually want to hang out with and all that, like that was actually a good positive for us too. But yeah, that is kind of what was coming to my mind when I kept seeing that Kevin O'Leary clip of him talking about quiet quitting and how he's so against it. It's like, well, bosses also need to take into consideration the system of things and kind of the workflow and the demands and the expectations, and they need to be the ones that are kind of like looking towards either strategies or at least tracking, like, what does this work day look like? I mean, if you think of it, if you have a site that's telling you to get this amount of productivity and then you can't even do it while you're at work, I mean, that says something, right? So all right, well, that's all I had to say about that, but thanks for listening.